November 30th, 1950. Koto-ri and Hagaru-ri, North Korea. History remembered one name, but Chosin was not saved by one man. By the afternoon of November 30th, the illusion had collapsed. Chinese forces had hit in strength around the Chosin Reservoir. The road south was under pressure. Wounded were piling up. The offensive that had been sold as momentum was turning into something colder and more humiliating. A trapped force trying to get out alive. At Koto-ri, Colonel Louis Chesty Puller and the 1st Marines were holding a perimeter that could not be allowed to break. At Hagaru-ri, Major General Oliver P. Smith was already thinking like a man whose problem was no longer victory, but survival with the division still intact. That is not the version most people know. The famous version is cleaner, louder, and easier to sell. Chesty Puller surrounded. Chesty Puller smiling at the odds. Chesty Puller delivering the line that still echoes through Marine culture. We've been looking for the enemy for some time now. We've finally found him. We're surrounded. That simplifies things. The line is part of the legend for a reason, but the legend also hides something. Chosin was not saved by swagger alone. It was held together by preparation, discipline, and a command fight that had started before the Chinese ring fully closed. The real fracture sat above Puller. Edward Almond, the Army Corps commander over the Marines in the East, wanted speed, aggression, and forward pressure. Smith did not trust the optimism coming from above. He believed the advance was outrunning intelligence, terrain, and logistics. He treated the road behind him as seriously as the ground in front of him. That difference in temperament was not cosmetic. It was the hidden pressure inside the whole campaign. One man was still chasing momentum. The other was already preparing for the possibility that the road south would become the only thing keeping his force from being destroyed. That is why Chosin becomes far more interesting the moment the myth starts to crack. Puller was real. Puller was formidable. By Korea, he was already one of the most decorated Marines in American history. But he was not commanding the entire operation. He was commanding the 1st Marines at Koto-ri, where his job was brutally practical. Hold the position, protect the line of withdrawal, and keep one section of a collapsing front from snapping. The broader architecture of survival belonged to Smith, and that distinction matters because the public legend usually erases it. The conditions made the whole thing even uglier. Between November 27th and December 13th, about 30,000 United Nations troops around Chosin were encircled by about 120,000 Chinese troops in sub-zero temperatures. Weapons froze. Vehicles failed. Frostbite hit men almost as hard as enemy fire. The campaign would later be remembered as one of the greatest fighting withdrawals in American military history. But first, it had to survive the simpler question: had the advance north already gone too far for the truth on the ground to save it? Some campaigns only make sense when the myth freezes, and the road itself forces you to subscribe before the real reason Chosin survived disappears under one famous name. That road was the whole case. Before the trap fully shut, Smith had already ordered Hagaru-ri developed as a base and had pushed for an airstrip there. It was not glamorous. It did not sound heroic. It sounded cautious, even pessimistic. But once the Chinese attacks came in force, that caution started looking less like pessimism and more like the difference between a battered breakout and a catastrophe. Chosin became a Marine legend because men fought hard. It became survivable because at least one commander had prepared for the possibility that someone else's confidence was about to get them encircled. The accepted version loves to remember the cigar, the line, and the aura around Puller. The harder version asks a more dangerous question. If Chosin became legendary because the Marines survived the impossible, who made the impossible survivable in the first place? And once that question is asked, the whole campaign starts to look less like a simple hero story and more like a collision between myth, command, and reality in frozen mountains. The road to Chosin was built out of success, and success can be more dangerous than panic. In September 1950, the Incheon landing had transformed the war. Seoul was retaken. United Nations forces surged north. The momentum was intoxicating. In the east, the 1st Marine Division landed at Wonsan after delays caused by minefields, and then pushed inland through rough terrain toward the Changjin, better known in the west as Chosin Reservoir. On paper, it looked like a force-exploiting victory. In practice, it was stretching itself across mountains, narrow roads, long supply lines, and severe weather. Smith saw the danger quickly. He did not move like a man who believed the war would be over by Christmas. That is where the real human tension begins. Almond and Smith were not just two officers with different styles. They represented two different ways of thinking under pressure. Almond pushed hard, radiated confidence, and remained closely aligned with General Douglas MacArthur's appetite for aggressive movement. Smith was controlled, methodical, and deeply suspicious of plans that looked clean on maps, but brittle on the ground. Museum and Marine Corps educational material on the campaign is direct about their friction. Almond repeatedly pushed speed, while Smith slowed the Marine advance because he believed the Corps commander was moving too aggressively with poor intelligence and inadequate respect for the terrain. That difference shaped the entire campaign before the Chinese attack even began. Smith treated Hagaru-ri not as a mere stop on the way north, but as a base that might one day be needed for regrouping, evacuation, and breakout. He ordered work on the airstrip there on November 19th. He concentrated supplies. He watched the road network with professional suspicion. Those choices are easy to underrate because they do not sound cinematic, but the campaign later depended on them. One of the reasons Chosin still matters is that the survival measures were being put in place before many senior voices fully admitted how exposed the force had become. Then, the Chinese struck in force. On November 27, 1950, the Chinese offensive crashed into the United Nations positions around the reservoir. The broader Chosin battle would run until December 13th. About 30,000 United Nations troops, later nicknamed the Chosin Few, were hit by roughly 120,000 Chinese troops. The weather was savage. The terrain favored infiltration, roadblocks, and night attacks. This was not a clean frontline battle where units could simply pivot and respond in tidy formation. Every hill, every cut in the road, and every exposed convoy became a pressure point. This is where the competitor script takes the easy road. It turns the campaign into a one-man act. Puller as the battle, Puller as the answer, Puller as the reason the Chinese offensive failed. That is precisely what makes the short script effective and historically thin at the same time. It grabs attention by stripping away the system, but Chosin was a system under violent strain. Puller mattered because he held one vital part of that system together. He was commanding the 1st Marines at Koto-ri, south of Hagaru-ri, on the main route the division would later need to use. If Koto-ri broke, the route south became even more fragile. If Koto-ri held, the division still had a hinge, and Puller did hold. On November 30th, Smith later wrote that Puller was attacked heavily at Koto-ri, but kept his perimeter intact. That line matters because it strips away the mythology and leaves the hard operational truth. Puller was not out there alone defeating history with a cigar. He was doing something harder and less romantic, holding the southern anchor of a larger force that was shifting from offensive movement to survival under encirclement. The same pattern appeared on the road between Koto-ri and Hagaru-ri. The Drysdale column, moving to reinforce Hagaru-ri, ran into severe Chinese attacks along the route. The road itself became a trap. Units were split. Vehicles were hit. Some elements pushed through. Others were cut apart. This was exactly the kind of terrain friction breakdown Smith had feared. Once Chinese forces held the heights and the narrow road segments, movement turned into a gamble and regrouping became a luxury. The plan was no longer clean. That is when command either reveals its depth or gets exposed as theater. By the end of November, courage was no longer the issue. The Marines would fight. The issue was whether the division could preserve cohesion under extreme cold, bad terrain, and mounting Chinese pressure long enough to force a way south. Puller's legend would become the face of that answer. But the machinery that made any answer possible had already been built by a commander who had spent days preparing for a disaster that other men were still talking around. Chosin did not unfold as one dramatic breakout scene. It unfolded as linked ordeals. Udom-ni had to fight back toward Hagaru-ri. Hagaru-ri had to hold. Koto-ri had to hold. The road had to be reopened, guarded, used, and fought for again. Wounded had to move. Trucks had to move. Artillery had to move. Aircraft had to matter. In campaigns like this, one strong unit means very little if another piece of the body collapses farther down the line. That is why Chosin was such a brutal test of command. It measured whether separated elements could still function as one force while under encirclement. Hagaru-ri was the center of gravity inside that body. Chinese forces attacked it hard during the night of November 28th and 29th. The position took serious casualties but held. More importantly, the airstrip there became the campaign's quiet lifeline. Smith had ordered work begun on November 19th, before the full scale of the disaster was visible to everybody else. On December 1st, C-47 aircraft began using the strip, even though it was still incomplete. That detail changes the whole feel of the battle. Someone had understood early that the road might fail, that the wounded might need another route, and that survival could not depend on wishful thinking from higher headquarters. To the north, the Marines around Udom-ni had to fight their way back through mountain passes where the Chinese had every advantage. Smith later described the movement in stark, practical terms. The 7th Marines leading, the 5th Marines protecting the rear, artillery and trains in the middle, walking wounded armed and marched, and the rest loaded into trucks. That image says more about Chosin than any slogan. Even the wounded had to remain part of the fighting system. Nothing about the breakout was clean. It was organized endurance under pressure. This is where Puller's legend and the harder reality briefly meet. The quote attributed to him works because surrounded troops do not need a lecture on geometry. They need a mental frame stronger than fear. Puller had that gift. He embodied hardness, certainty, and aggressive morale. Men under him could feel that. But morale alone does not preserve heavy equipment, coordinate multiple regiments, keep air-ground support functioning, and refuse a panicked rush south. Smith did that from the division level. Puller and Smith were not competing in the same lane. One projected fighting confidence. The other imposed structural survival. Chosin needed both. The command tension became explicit on November 30th. Almond came forward and pushed urgency. Smith resisted being stampeded. He made clear that his movement would be governed by the evacuation of the wounded, and that he did not intend to burn through equipment and abandon practical survival in order to satisfy someone else's appetite for speed. That response is one of the most revealing moments in the entire campaign. It sounds administrative, even cold. In reality, it was moral steel. Smith was refusing the kind of false decisiveness that turns a bad position into a rout. The breakout formally began from Hagaru-ri on December 6th. Smith's plan was not the language of escape. The 5th Marines would hold the airfield. The 7th Marines would attack south and clear the main supply route. Air support would continue overhead. He intended to bring out the wounded, the dead, where possible, and the equipment. That last part matters. Smith was not trying to save fragments. He was trying to preserve the division as a fighting force while under conditions that should have broken it. Later educational material on the campaign stresses exactly that point. The breakout became legendary, not simply because the Marines survived, but because they did so without surrendering cohesion. Chinese losses were severe, but exact numbers remain disputed and are often inflated in popular retellings. What can be said more safely is that the Chinese 9th Army Group suffered grievous combat and cold weather losses, and that the campaign badly damaged its operational effectiveness for a time. That matters because Chosin was not a simple defeat for one side and a simple victory for the other. It was a Chinese strategic shock, a Marine fighting triumph, a human disaster, and a command case study, all at once. That complexity is exactly what the simplified legend cannot hold. The hidden payoff inside Chosin is not that the famous legend is false. It is that the legend points at the right battlefield and the wrong explanation. Take Puller first. He earned the myth. He had already fought in Haiti, Nicaragua, Guadalcanal, Cape Gloucester, Palaleu, and Korea. He was awarded 5 Navy Crosses, a distinction unique among Marines. By the time Chosin happened, he was already larger than life inside the Corps. There is no need to cheapen that. The problem begins when fame turns a commander into a shortcut. Puller becomes the answer, and once he becomes the answer, the campaign itself becomes easier to misremember. That shortcut hides the real balance of power at Chosin. Puller did not command the division. He did not create the defensive infrastructure at Hagaru-ri. He did not set the overall breakout architecture. He did not conduct the larger political and command friction with Almond. He was essential, but he was not singular. That difference matters because the accepted version often behaves as if one regimental commander personally saved the entire eastern front of the campaign. The historical record points somewhere more complicated and, frankly, more interesting. The campaign starts to look different the moment O.P. Smith is put back in the center. He had already learned harsh lessons in earlier wars. He did not trust momentum for its own sake. He took terrain seriously. He took logistics seriously. He treated the line of communication as part of the battle rather than as a housekeeping issue. He pushed the airstrip at Hagaru-ri before it became obviously indispensable. He slowed the advance when he believed optimism had outrun reality. And when the trap closed, he refused to behave like a man who could solve it by throwing away equipment, accelerating blindly, and hoping aggression would compensate for structure. That is why Smith remains oddly less famous than Puller. Puller gives the public a face, a quote, a mood, and a masculine icon. Smith gives the public logistics, foresight, and command judgment. One fits on a poster. The other explains why the poster is incomplete. Chosin is remembered as a legend of marine toughness, and that is fair. But toughness alone does not explain why the force got out with so much of its discipline, material, and wounded preserved. The answer lies in a combination of preparation, cohesion, and leadership that was much less theatrical than the legend later became. Then there is the crueler irony. One of the greatest battlefield legends in marine history was born inside a campaign that also exposes the danger of top-level overconfidence. MacArthur wanted rapid movement north. Almond pushed hard in the east. Smith had reason to doubt both the intelligence picture and the practical assumptions behind that speed. The breakout that later looked glorious was only necessary because the larger advance had already pushed a force into a position where heroism became the tax for earlier misjudgment. Chosin did not prove that aggression wins. It proved that aggression without disciplined realism can force other men to become legends just to survive it. That is the true myth versus reality gap. The myth says, surrounded Marines, one fearless colonel, glorious breakout. The fuller reality says, yes, extraordinary endurance. Yes, real battlefield leadership from Puller. Yes, one of the great fighting withdrawals in American military history. But also a case of command friction, foresight ignored, and a quieter commander doing the structural work that made later heroism survivable. Once that wider frame is seen, Chosin stops being smaller. It becomes bigger, heavier, and harder to forget. By the time the fighting force reached Hungnam and the Chosin campaign closed, the outcome still resisted easy labels. The Chinese had forced a major United Nations withdrawal in northeastern Korea. At the same time, the Marines and attached troops had fought their way out, preserved much of their equipment, evacuated many of their wounded, and denied the enemy the annihilation that had seemed possible once the encirclement tightened. Official Marine educational material still frames the battle around that brutal imbalance. About 30,000 United Nations troops surrounded by about 120,000 Chinese in extreme cold. That scale alone explains why Chosin never faded inside Marine memory. It was too punishing, too improbable, and too revealing. Puller emerged from Chosin with his legend burning even brighter. He received his 5th Navy Cross for heroism during the campaign, and was promoted to Brigadier General in January 1951. In Marine culture, he became almost ancestral, quoted, ritualized, and invoked far beyond the normal life of a decorated officer. None of that happened by accident. He had the combat record, the bearing, and the battlefield force of personality to survive contact with myth and come out even larger. But Chosin leaves a sharper lesson than hero worship. Who really saved Chosin? Not one man, not one quote, not one last charge into the snow. Chosin was saved because the chain did not break. Puller held hard at Koto-ri. The northern regiments fought back toward Hagaru-ri instead of disintegrating. Engineers made the airstrip usable before it was fully ready. Air support helped keep a trapped force alive. Non-commissioned officers sustained discipline in conditions built to destroy it. And above all, Smith refused to confuse optimism with command. He had prepared for the road south before other men were ready to admit it might be needed. When the crisis came, that preparation stopped the campaign from becoming a total disaster. That is why Puller's most famous line changes, meaning once the rest of the campaign is brought back into view, we're surrounded. That simplifies things, survives because it is perfect morale language. But as history, it is incomplete. The situation was not simple. It was almost impossibly complex. Frostbite, roadblocks, split commands, wounded stacked into trucks, higher level pressure, an enemy moving through mountains in the dark. The greatness at Chosin was not that complexity vanished. It was that enough leaders and enough Marines stayed disciplined inside that complexity to force a way out. And that is the final irony. One of the most famous legends in Marine history was born inside a campaign that warns against trusting legends too early. Chesty Puller belongs in the story. He belongs in it forever. But once the snow settles, the harder truth remains. Chosin did not survive because history found one hero. Chosin survived because one hero held his peace, while another man, quieter and less marketable, had already prepared the ground that kept the whole force from being buried there.